Okay. All right. So today we're going to talk about Nagarjuna. I think in some ways, in terms of the classical Indian tradition of Buddhism, Nagarjuna is something of a peak. I think it is also fairly widely acknowledged that after Siddhartha Gautama himself, Nagarjuna is probably the most famous and influential Buddhist philosopher of classical India. Something I noticed making the last video is I think there's several different distinctions to be made about what we're talking about when we say Buddhist. Um, for one thing, although we tend to see Buddhism as a sort of religion separate and equal to Hinduism, Buddhism is a bit of a movement within Hinduism, I think. And amongst these philosophers then, Buddhism is a movement within philosophy, that is to say, even a more secular matter than it is as a soteriological or life-changing or community organizing movement that it is out on the streets at that time. So, so anyway, that's something to think about when we're thinking about these philosophers. They are Siddhartha Gautama and Nagarjuna are both upper-class Hindu gentlemen, in fact. All right, so let's take a look then at the very interesting and cool Nagarjuna. We're going to do a little bit of metaphysics and cosmology today, so that's fine. One of the things we want to keep our eye on the ball here is what exactly, how does this philosophy, after all, because we know about Siddhartha Gautama that he didn't really do philosophy, he didn't really do metaphysics. So what about these people, these classical Indian philosophers who call themselves Buddhists? And I think you'll see that Nagarjuna is very, very Buddhist indeed. He lived in probably mostly the 2nd century of our era, the Common Era, probably writing somewhere again about 200 years after the time of Christ. He was, again, a upper-class Brahmin, actually probably from southern India. I think I got that wrong in another video, who became a Buddhist monk. All right, and some of the Mahayana sutras were often presented as the words of the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama himself, sometimes. And then it's probably true that Nagarjuna himself had a hand in composing some of those sutras, perhaps the Prajnaparamitra, the Wisdom Sutra, the Madhyamaka, the middle way. And so his, whatever that is, the Mula Madhyamakarika, the fundamental verses of the fundamental wisdom of the middle way. Buddhism has this notion of the middle way. Siddhartha Gautama, remember, was torn between ordinary people who needed to live ordinary worldly lives and extreme ascetics who had withdrawn from the world completely, and he was looking for a middle way. Nagarjuna, very self-consciously a follower of the Buddha, of Siddhartha Gautama, and very self-consciously trying to get back to basics. A metaphysics that steers between materialism and idealism. As I've mentioned a couple times, let me step out of here just for a second. One of the greatest challenges of studying classical Asian philosophy is that they really do not have the kind of Cartesian distinction between the mind and the body. Certainly not this ontological distinction that there's something that's different between the mind and the body, but they also don't have this kind of gestalt of seeing that there's a kind of an inner and the outer. They don't have the skeptical question mark marking the boundary between the inner and the outer. They really just don't do that. So when we're looking at Nagarjuna, we want to see that. A typical misinterpretation of Buddhism, in my opinion, is an idealist interpretation that says that what Buddhism is saying is that the mind is constructing kind of representations of the world. That's something that the philosopher Kant says. We call that view ultimately transcendental idealism, the view that ultimately things are mental. Again, a distinctly European rationalist idea. Notably, I noticed that my friends and colleagues in Germany, where you have a very, very powerful influence and presence of Kant on the philosophical scene to this day, tend also to have a kind of Kantian interpretation of Buddhism often. I would say that. I hope I don't get in trouble for saying it. Okay, So yeah, materialism and idealism, a distinction that is characteristic of post-Cartesian European philosophy. And that's not what we're looking at here. Where are we? There we are. I got to figure out how to use this damn thingamabobber. There we go. Still back again. Are we okay? Alrighty. Alrighty. So we only have a couple of these Sanskrit terms, three really: svabhava and Nirvana, and the last one that we'll look at. Svabhava, own being. Own being is, where is that coming from? That's coming from Kantsi's famous translation of the Diamond Sutra, the long sutra on perfect wisdom. And he translates that word svabhava there as own being. And in the philosophical books that are being written about Nagarjuna these days, by the way, that notion of svabhava as translated as own being is taken up, I think, by Garfield and a couple of other people writing. Anyway, mental formations, right? Words or concepts, and then we come to think of things as real. You can think of prejudices as mental formations, that kind of thing. Things don't have to be wrong to be mental formations. So other than sort of synonyms of svabhava, essence, the notion that something has an essence, substance, again, the metaphysical idea that there are sort of substances, intrinsicness, the notion that something could be intrinsic to a thing, and especially independence then in relation to that own being translation, the idea that something could stand on its own. You can take anything from the universe and imagine it by itself in an empty void in your mind's eye, if you wish, but only because that thing's already there. If you think about why and how it's there, you're going to quickly find out that that has to do with pretty much its relationships with everything else. And so even the numerical distinctness of objects, what do I mean by that? I just mean that there's me and you makes two and he makes three, right? That there's four apples in the bowl, so there's four different ones because they're numerically distinct. That's, again, sort of the world of the many. And so notice then the claim is a metaphysical claim about any object, in the same way that the artifact, say a chair, tells you about the artisan, the builder of the chair. But then these kinds of relations are reflected in everything. But so then the self, and again, remember, not a really strong boundary between the mind and the body, not an assumed, internalized, intuitive boundary between the mind and the body here. So the self, the soul, the mind, another one of these things, just like the objects on the desk. What is the illusion? The illusion is that somehow it stands by itself and exists independently of other things, that it could ultimately be understood independently of other things. So then, all right, so if we see this, and again, think of it both in terms of this notion of the mind and the self, which is, of course, where the action is for us here, but then notice that we have extended this now to ordinary objects, a sort of metaphysics of concrete particulars, if you will, individual objects. And the idea is that they are not really ultimately individual. We're being asked to consider things as a one. So it's a question of getting rid of a kind of illusion, training ourselves out of the illusion of seeing things as separate and independent from each other. And then, so then the question is, what is it that we see if we've done this kind of therapy, if you will, and we've stopped sort of seeing things as individuals and as individuated, and we've started seeing things only as kind of parts of this much larger thing, such that it is unimaginable without them. What is it that we see then? And we can ask that question both in terms of material objects and in terms of what we're thinking about in terms of the soul or the mind. So svabhava, and the other concept here, and again I'll talk about Nirvana a little bit too, is sunyata. Sunyata, being as emptiness. That is, it's an ontological thesis about primary being. Primary being is emptiness. Remember, that's not the same as nothingness. It's a misconception to say that the teaching is that nothing is real. Nothing is independently existing. Nothing can really be individuated from anything else. And so things are in emptiness. There's an emptiness where you thought there was sort of a wall that couldn't be moved or a surface. There isn't anything like that there. So first of all, remember this dynamic process of dependent arising. We saw with the 12-point cycle of dependent arising in the Four Noble Truths that there is this dialectical process where things are coming to be and passing away. And of course, that's basic Hinduism too. That's nothing new. That's fundamental Indian spirituality. Everything is coming to be and passing away. So emptiness, then the lack of, there isn't a boundary between one thing and the rest of the world. And I think the sense is that that is what allows change to occur. That is why the universe is a dynamic place, because there's always this kind of flow. So the soteriological, what's that big word? We've talked about it at least once or twice before now, the third bullet point there, meaning it's life-changing. So some philosophies or other teachings might just be some teachings if I teach you how to, I don't know, do something. But the soteriological, nowadays we associate this with spiritual teachings mostly, not so much with academic philosophy, much to its loss, I would say, that it's a life-changing thing. Buddhism is soteriological in the sense that if you follow if you absorb the Four Noble Truths and do your best to follow the Eightfold Path, then your life will change, and that's why you should learn about it. That's the idea. So here the goal is to cultivate the perspective of oneness. What Nagarjuna wants you to do is to cultivate the perspective of oneness and dissipate your perspective of multiplicity. And again, that has to do not only with your sense of your own self and your own ego as facing against the rest of the cosmos, but also even in your perception of ordinary natural things. So Nirvana, another one of these words, like karma or Buddha itself, another one of these words that we have a pop culture notion of it, I guess, as some sort of ecstatic state, right? Take the drug and you'll get to nirvana. But how it is described in the literature, I wouldn't know myself, but interestingly described in different times and places in the same way as the experience of the falling away of the boundary between the self and the world. There's an English language book by a man named Harding called On Having No Head that describes this experience of nirvana. The falling away of the boundary between the self and the world, which is what we've been talking about, right? That notion of oneness rather than multiplicity. So then that is the way then that the karmic soul is erased in the teachings of Nagarjuna. It is erased by seeing it as fully integrated with the rest of the cosmos, which is not the same thing as saying it doesn't exist. It's not the same thing as saying it's an illusion. It's not the same thing as saying that it's mental. Let's talk about that a little bit more, consciousness and cognition here. Aristotle's onto a lot of this stuff. In the Greek tradition, we call a lot of these ideas the Eleatic ideas of Parmenides, very similar to some of what we're hearing from Nagarjuna here. I think not coincidentally, but that's another story. Anyway, Aristotle argues for the law of the excluded middle. That is, he says it cannot be both P and not P, X and not X. Cannot be. And then that would extend into logic in terms of, well, these propositions have to be either true or false. They can't be both true and not true and that sort of thing. And Aristotle, now you have to think the thought, right? He's not just laying down some law. Think about it. He says, you can't really produce knowledge the way, say, a scientist produces knowledge, right? You just can't do it unless you distinguish between one thing and another thing. Each thing is itself and not another thing. And why? Is it just a, no, it's not just a law. Think about it. What are you going to say? What are you going to do if you can't distinguish one thing from another and what it is that you're talking about? So he understood, Aristotle, I don't think, was naive about what the advocates of a oneness consciousness were saying. It's just that he was interested in what we would call empirical science, and he just didn't see any prospect for that. And I think it's an interesting question here. The question is, when we take the perspective of the one, then what is the research project there? What is it that we are going to learn? And I don't say that in a skeptical way, I say that in a curious way. So, so this is the way, sometimes people think Aristotle's bad for this reason, which is not true at all. It's just he's interested in what he's interested in. But he has this dividing taxonomizing method, and that's the way you live in the world of the many. That is just what it is to live in the world of the many. And remember, living in the world of the many and seeing yourself as one out of many is the source of your problems on these teachings. So Nagarjuna teaches that nirvana is the perception of the one, just as we see it described, the dropping away of the boundary between the self and the rest of the cosmos. And so that question I was raising, what kind of knowledge, when we cultivate this understanding of interdependence? Nagarjuna is asking you to train your mind, right? It's not magic. He's saying, look, cultivate your awareness of interdependence and interconnection and try and tamp down this gestalt, this projection that you have of the independence of everything. So let's take that then out to that further level of cosmology. Atomists. What's an atomist? Someone who thinks that the cosmos is made out of some kind of bottom level. There's some kind of bottom level unit of the cosmos. Democritus is the Greek about that, the atom, the thing that cannot be further divided. There were plenty of atomists also in the Indian classical tradition. The Abhidharma school taught that the universe was made up of dharmas. But dharmas were mental, what we would think of as mental things or experiences, maybe. It's not clear what empiricists are talking about when they talk about experience either, right? So anybody notice who thinks, whether they have a materialist conception of that or an idealist or mental conception of that there's some bottom level to reality, is under this illusion of svabhava. What is the illusion of svabhava? That is anything that exists independently of anything else. And each one of Democritus's atoms swirling in the void looks like it's one of those. It's something conceived as that. The notion of objective reality is svabhava. That's a mental formation, right? There's reality, there's external reality or objective reality versus what? But then this notion that you have an enduring mind, it's like, hey, enduring mind in there, maybe you should doubt what, the external reality is like. But wait a minute, what about the enduring mind in there? That's svabhava too. Do you think there's something in there that is just independent and doesn't depend on everything else to exist? Sunyata is what makes change. Again, we talked about that in the last video when we were talking about Mahayana and the Heart Sutra. It is the emptiness of the bowl. It is the emptiness of the doorway or the window. It is the emptiness of the airwaves between the sender and the viewer of the TV. This is a Buddhist analysis of TV. That emptiness is the power. And the question is, what are you filling the emptiness with? Now, another thing on that last bullet point right there, you might think that if you say that everything is one and everything is interconnected to the point that necessarily the rest of the universe, granting me, and granting the rest of the universe necessarily me, right? I mean, granting that the state of affairs is what it is, I'm part of it. That looks like it could be what we would call fatalistic. Fatalistic in the sense that everything has to be the way that it is. Couldn't be otherwise. But that too would be a manifestation of svabhava, of the mental formation of svabhava. And that would be seeing what? The cosmos itself, perhaps, as that thing that existed independently of what? Good question. So just to take that a little step further, almost done, I think you're starting, I think you can see the point here. Well, let's talk about causation there. So svabhava, right? I think of it as sort of the solid thing, the solid surface, the thing that sort of is cutting through. And that's the thing that isn't real. So you see a classical notion of causation as sort of linear causation. The causes are kind of coming up from the past in these long linear chains of causality. And we're kind of surfing the wave here in the present of this wave of past causation that we live with. But that is, again, is that sort of one-way kind of notion of causation. And it looks like those causes would be those causes whether they had their effects or not. But Nagarjuna says that's all an illusion too. He says that these relations are symmetrical and they run both ways. The birth of the son is what causes the father. It's by virtue of having the child that the parent becomes the parent, is an example that he uses, in fact, and others. So a causal loop, there's a causal loop there rather than a linear progression. This notion of a causal loop involves us in some interesting questions. If I came from the future and met my present self and gave myself the design for the time machine, and then went back to the future, and then my present self took the design and made the time machine, right? Then that would be a causal loop, right? But that is sort of Nagarjuna's version, but look at this micro level, the level I just described in terms of relations between people, relations between things. That is cause and effect relations. And the idea here is that they are entirely both ways. And so then on that last point there, then the ego, right, and the mind is caused by the thoughts and feelings. The ego mind is caused by the thoughts and feelings. And a way of understanding Buddhism, and the last thing we're going to look at in this first half of the class is Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism. And so let's go on to ask, how is this Buddhist? All right, and just to spell this out now, just to follow along, and then this is the last one. I know there's a lot of words on this. I don't know. It's abstract material. So again, the original problem was the soul stuck on the wheel of karma, rather fatalistically and helplessly, it seemed. And so Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, started off, and it's baked into the Buddha Dharma, right? Because the original Buddha Dharma has the 12-point cycle of dependent arising and all the rest of the stuff. And the original Buddha Dharma has the 5 aggregates of self. And just the very idea that the self is an aggregate of things, remember, is what I thought was the most important takeaway for you from that. So, all right, so that's the idea, is this, first of all, moving the soul along the Bodhi path in one lifetime, and then a steady attention to consciousness until finally you get to sort of erasure of the self altogether. So, okay, fine. In Nagarjuna, then, that erasure of the soul or the self is achieved from this teaching of looking at things in terms of the many instead of the one. It is a perspectival change that leads to Nirvana on this teaching. Oneness, that is mutual dependence to the point of identity. That's the third bullet point. What do I mean by to the point of identity? To the point where we have to say these are really actually the same thing. Like the universe is one big event, and all of the parts of the event are integrated with all the rest of the event. And of course, what that does, getting back then to psychology and spirituality, is it achieves maximum altruism, maximum selflessness, to the extent that altruism is selflessness. And it certainly is taken that way in these teachings, no doubt. Loving kindness and compassion for all living beings. And the Buddha's return, as I said, a Mahayana dogma that the Buddha, the true Buddha, and there are many, understands that they have to go back into the world of samsara, the world of dukkha, the world of suffering, the world of dissatisfaction, until the final liberation into satisfaction of all living beings. And then a technical takeaway, the last thing I'm going to say about this, Nagarjuna then not an idealist, not someone who says that everything is mental or everything is the mind. A very common misconception of Buddhism, one that's influenced by Kantianism, and one that you should beware. So, okay, so basic teachings. There are a lot of other things we could say about Nagarjuna. In fact, I'm just going over some basic metaphysical claims that Nagarjuna said that are close enough to and in line enough with the other things that we've been talking about that it's accessible to us. But Nagarjuna is a major philosopher with many writings, and there are, as I mentioned before, quite a few books being published nowadays by philosophers who are examining Nagarjuna's ideas. There is also a tantalizing scholarship about the relationship between these Indian ideas and classical Greek ideas, where there's some substance to that as well. So wonderful topic, and I will give you some further things to look at in terms of studying Nagarjuna. And from here, we will move to the north, to Tibet. Okay.